When the phone rang that morning and I heard my daughter's voice, I never expected the words that came next, words so sharp they cut deeper than any storm tide I had faced before. She spoke quickly, almost like she was reading a grocery list, telling me we're leaving tomorrow. Your beach house has already been sold. Bye. And in that instant, my heart seemed to stop as if the world itself tilted. My daughter, the girl I raised, the one I once carried on my hip through the waves of Cape Cod, was saying she had taken the only place that tied me to my late husband, the place where our love still seemed to live. I could hear the pride in her tone, as though she had done something bold, something final, yet she forgot one thing, and I laughed, not because I found it funny, but because sometimes laughter is the only way to cover the sting. What she didn't know was that the house she claimed to have sold wasn't my home at all, and in that instant a quiet fire began to burn in me, not of anger alone, but of strength I didn't realize I still carried. If you've ever felt betrayed by the very people you loved the most, if you've ever been blindsided by family who should have stood by you but instead turned away, please tap the like button or leave a comment. Your support means more than you might guess. It keeps these stories alive and gives me courage to share them with you, and knowing you're listening makes me feel less alone. Thank you for being here with me right now, because what I'm about to tell you is a storm of love, loss, greed, and justice, and I promise it will carry you all the way to the shore. My name is Helen Mitchell. I am 57 years old, and I live in a small coastal town in Massachusetts, where the air always tastes faintly of salt, and the gulls cry like restless children overhead. I became a widow 8 years ago when my husband Daniel passed suddenly one gray November morning, leaving me with memories as warm as the quilts we used to share, and a beach house that had been his pride since the first plank was laid. That house wasn't just a building to me, it was a scrapbook of our lives, every floorboard telling a story, every paint chip carrying the echo of laughter or the whisper of sorrow. Daniel and I had built that place slowly, not with grand money or hired crews, but with our own hands, scraping, saving, sanding, painting, and celebrating each tiny step. When he was gone, the cottage became my anchor, the only place that made me feel he was still just around the corner, waiting with a cup of coffee in his big chipped mug. I kept the curtains he chose, the rocking chair where he sat every evening, even the old wind chimes that clattered through storms, because letting go of them felt like letting go of him. But as the years rolled forward, my daughter Madison began to drift in ways I didn't understand. She was once so tender, the kind of girl who drew hearts on my birthday cards and whispered secrets on long walks by the shore. Yet after she married Tyler, something hardened in her, like the ocean freezing under a sudden cold front. Tyler was ambitious, always calculating, speaking of investments and leverage as though people and love were chips on his poker table. He looked at my cottage not as a memory but as equity, not as a home but as a ticket to another rung on his restless ladder. Madison began echoing his words, testing me with comments like, "You don't need all that space alone," or "think what you could do with the money," as though grief and memories were clutter to be boxed up and sold. At first, I brushed it off, telling myself it was just their youthful hunger for more. But the unease gnawed at me like the sea nibbling steadily at the edge of the shore. I wanted to believe the best of them, wanted to believe my daughter still saw me as more than a stepping stone, but her voice on that phone call told me otherwise. Still, as shocking as her betrayal was, as piercing as it felt to hear my own child declare that my sanctuary was gone, a strange calm filled me too. It wasn't resignation, it was something stronger, a quiet certainty that came from the truth I carried close to my chest. The house they thought they had taken, the treasure they believed they had snatched, wasn't the one that truly belonged to me. And in time, they would learn that the ocean does not simply give without taking back. Life has a rhythm, just like the tides, and greed always leaves footprints that the waves eventually wash away. I sat there after hanging up the phone, staring at the picture of Daniel smiling by the porch swing, and I whispered to him that our story wasn't ending here. Not like this, not stolen away by ignorance and arrogance. No, I would hold steady, just as he taught me, and I would ride this storm until the tide turned in my favor. It started slowly, the way storms always do. First just a breeze that you think will pass, then a gust that rattles the windows, and before long the whole house shakes. At first, Madison's hints seemed harmless. Small remarks dropped over Sunday dinners when she would say things like, "You're rattling around in that cottage all by yourself," or "Don't you think you deserve something easier than all that upkeep?" And I would laugh it off, not realizing the weight those words carried. She had always been a dreamer, someone who wanted bigger shoes than she could walk in, but Tyler gave her vocabulary for those dreams, filling her head with real estate talk, quick flips, and smart moves, as if human lives were just lines on a profit and loss sheet. I told myself they were just enthusiastic, that they didn't mean harm, but looking back, I see how each little comment was a chip in the stone of trust between us, and every chip weakened the foundation until cracks appeared where love used to hold us steady. Then came the smaller betrayals, the ones I wanted to overlook because love makes you blind in all the worst ways. There was the time my grandmother's pearl earrings vanished from my jewelry box, only for Madison to shrug and say she hadn't seen them, even though I remembered her complimenting them weeks before. Another time, a charge appeared on my credit card for a boutique hotel in Boston, a place I had never stepped foot in, and Tyler laughed when I asked about it, saying maybe my memory was slipping, that banks always made mistakes. There was also the envelope I gave them once, meant as a small loan to help with car repairs, and instead of gratitude, I overheard Tyler telling a friend it was nothing but an advance on what was already his. Each of these moments stung, but I silenced myself, telling my heart to be patient, because mothers forgive, and maybe, if I showed them only kindness, they would return kindness to me. That was my mistake. I believed goodness could shield me from greed. The turning point came the day I returned from the market and found a man photographing my porch without so much as a knock. He looked embarrassed when I asked why, muttering something about preparing listing materials, and when I called Madison later, she brushed it off as a mix-up, saying she must have clicked the wrong button online. The seed of doubt that had been growing in me sprouted tall that day, its shadow falling across every interaction. Soon after that, a smiling notary appeared at my kitchen table with papers she called routine, documents she urged me to sign quickly because my daughter said it was urgent. The sticky note on the folder read, "Just trust me. Mom," in Madison's neat handwriting, and my hand trembled as I set down the pen. The air around me felt heavy with something unspoken, and I realized I was standing on sand that was shifting fast beneath my feet. The cottage that had once been a symbol of love and family was being reduced to a prize in someone else's game. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to remind them that this house was built with sweat and laughter and tears, not just nails and wood, but my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I stood silent, listening as Tyler boasted about buyers lined up and timelines moving fast, his words like stones dropped into the calm of my kitchen. Madison's eyes darted away when I looked at her, as though she couldn't quite bear to see what she was doing, yet she said nothing to stop it either. I realized then that the roles in our family had shifted without me noticing. I was no longer the mother at the center. I was the obstacle to be maneuvered around, the signature they needed to erase. The injustice wasn't just that they wanted to sell my home. It was that they were stealing the last piece of my husband, the part of him that still lived in the boards and beams of that cottage. And they were doing it with the casual cruelty of people who think they will never face consequences. It was right when I felt the walls pressing in the tightest, when I thought my daughter and her husband had finally boxed me into a corner I couldn't escape from, that I stumbled across something so small most people would have brushed it aside. One gray afternoon, as I sorted through the week's mail with the same routine I'd followed for years, I came across a county tax notice. At first glance, it looked ordinary, the kind of envelope you dread but never question. Yet when I pulled the paper free and let my eyes run down the lines, something caught me. The parcel number wasn't mine. My cottage, the one Daniel and I had poured our sweat and laughter into, had always been tied to a neat row of digits I could recite by heart. But here was a stranger number, attached to a property I didn't immediately recognize. A little ripple of confusion stirred in me, but beneath it something else too. A flicker of curiosity, a spark of hope, the first since this nightmare began. I took the paper to my hutch where I kept every important document in careful order, each envelope and receipt stacked the way Daniel always teased me about. He used to say I filed papers tighter than a librarian with her glasses crooked on her nose. I smiled at the memory even as I pulled out the thick folder of old statements, laying them side by side with the new notice. And there it was, plain as the sunrise. My house had one parcel number. This notice carried another. I remembered vaguely that down the lane, past the dune grass and closer to the marsh, sat a storm-battered shack that had once been a fisherman's place before hurricanes tore half its roof away. No one had lived there in years, and yet somehow this was the property number printed on the official paperwork in my hand. My pulse quickened. Could it be that Madison and Tyler, so convinced of their cleverness, had mixed up the very foundation of their plan? The more I looked, the more their sloppy arrogance revealed itself. The contract Tyler had left on my kitchen counter, perhaps on purpose, as though the sight of it would break my will, contained my name spelled wrong, Michaels instead of Mitchell, a mistake so obvious I almost laughed out loud. The notary stamp that had been shoved under my nose carried a date that didn't align with the bank alert I'd gotten about a suspicious transfer, and the glossy flyer that showed up in my mailbox proudly advertised brand new deck and renovated basement, which would have been comical if it wasn't so insulting, because my cottage had never had more than a crawl space full of damp sand and the occasional crab. Their fantasy listing was polished like a seashell, but anyone who held it up to the light would see right through it. Still, I knew better than to trust only my own eyes. When something matters this much, you don't rely on gut alone. That's when I carried the papers down the street to my neighbor Ruth. She's a retired title attorney with a mind as sharp as a gull's beak and a kindness wrapped in sugar and butter. She never visits without bringing a basket of scones so good they could make a woman forget every diet she ever swore by. I spread the documents out on her table while the scent of warm cinnamon filled the air, and I watched as her eyebrows climbed higher with every page. She tapped one finger on the mismatched parcel number and said in her calm, deliberate way, "That's interesting." Coming from Ruth, those two words were thunder. I knew immediately what they meant. There was a crack in the dam, and if I kept steady, water would pour through. Ruth explained carefully that while most people confuse addresses, the law doesn't. A parcel number is a fingerprint, a unique identity that cannot be swapped without consequences. If Madison and Tyler had mixed them up, if they had built their grand scheme on the wrong property, then what they were trying to sell wasn't mine at all. In fact, they might be stepping into a pit they didn't even see. My chest swelled with something I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. For the first time, I wasn't drowning in fear. I was standing on the shore watching the tide turn. Greed had blinded them, and in their blindness, they had overlooked the very detail that would undo them. That night, I returned home with my heart lighter than it had been in months. I made myself tea, the same chamomile blend Daniel always brewed when storms rattled our windows, and I carried the mug out onto the porch. The moon laid a silver path across the water, and the waves sang their eternal rhythm. I thought of Daniel then, his steady hands guiding me through every project we ever undertook. his voice reminding me that problems could be solved one nail, one board, one careful choice at a time. I whispered into the night that he would have been proud, because I wasn't going to crumble. I was going to use patience the way sailors use the wind, to my advantage. The more I thought, the more I realized how much groundwork I had quietly laid years earlier. After Daniel's passing, I had placed our cottage into a legal trust, one that guaranteed me the right to live there until my last breath. At the time, it felt like a boring piece of paperwork, something my lawyer suggested and I signed without thinking much about it. But now I saw it as the anchor that would hold fast against this storm. The house Madison and Tyler thought they had seized wasn't truly theirs to touch, and the parcel they had wrapped their greedy fingers around was nothing more than a decaying shack destined for demolition. Life has its own poetry, and sometimes it takes years before the rhyme appears. Sitting on that porch, the spark of hope flared into something brighter. I realized I didn't need to shout or rage or beg. I didn't need to confront them in tears or demand their respect. All I needed to do was wait, because like the sea, time reveals everything. Their arrogance had led them straight into a trap of their own design, and I wouldn't have to lift a finger to see justice served. I smiled for the first time in weeks, not a bitter smile, but a quiet one, full of certainty. The waves rolled in and out, steady as breath, and I knew the tide was beginning to shift in my favor. The night after I discovered their mistake, I sat at my kitchen table with the lamp casting a soft golden circle over the papers spread before me, and I felt something shift inside. For weeks, I had been the quiet, cornered widow, clutching memories while others circled like gulls over a scrap of bread. But now I was different. I had information, I had patience, and more than anything, I had the one thing greedy people never carry: foresight. Instead of reacting in anger or letting myself unravel in front of them, I knew I had to play it carefully, because storms are survived not by those who fight the waves, but by those who ride them. I decided my role was not the helpless victim, but the quiet fisherman, lowering bait on a line and waiting for the greedy fish to bite. The bait was simple. I gave them silence. I didn't confront Madison about the parcel number. I didn't wave the trust papers in her face. I didn't call Tyler out for the sloppy contract. I smiled when they mentioned buyers, nodded when they bragged about timelines, and even offered them coffee while they whispered together over their spreadsheets. To them, it must have looked like I was finally surrendering, like the old woman had grown too tired to resist, and they leaned into that illusion with all the confidence of gamblers sure the dice were loaded. But underneath my calm smile, I was watching, recording, memorizing each move, because the best way to win against people who think they're clever is to let them underestimate you. Still, silence alone wasn't enough, so I built my boundaries quietly but firmly. I checked my accounts daily. I put alerts on every card. I set my phone to notify me of even the smallest withdrawal. I kept my folder of documents locked in a cabinet instead of lying loose on my desk. I changed the locks on the cottage when Madison wasn't around, using the excuse of storm season safety, if anyone asked, and the jingling of the new keys in my pocket felt like armor. I had spent too long trusting blindly, and now it was time to protect not just the property, but myself. Even small details like refusing to sign for deliveries or double-checking any paper shoved under my nose became little shields I carried day after day. But the strongest part of my plan wasn't the bait or the boundaries. It was the backup I quietly assembled. I spoke again with Ruth, who promised to keep an eye on filings at the county office and smiled in that lawyerly way that told me she was more than ready to pounce if necessary. I met with my banker, a woman named Claire, who had been in my water aerobics class for years, and I explained that I wanted every transaction involving my accounts flagged and verified by me personally. Claire squeezed my hand, her eyes twinkling with both mischief and loyalty, and said she had always suspected Tyler's big talk wasn't backed by much more than hot air. Even the title office manager, a man I'd once lent an umbrella to on a rainy afternoon, promised to alert me if any strange requests surfaced. My quiet network of allies stitched together from years of neighborly kindness was suddenly the net I could rely on. I found a strange humor in it, too, the kind that only older women seem to understand. I joked to Ruth that if Madison and Tyler wanted so badly to sell something, perhaps I should hand them the deed to my old garden shed and see how they explained the leaky roof to their buyers. We laughed over scones until I nearly spilled my tea, and that laughter lightened my spirit more than I can describe. There is a freedom that comes from knowing you are no longer cornered, that the enemy believes they are winning, while in truth they are already tangled in their own mistakes. Humor became part of my armor, a reminder that I still had control over how I carried myself, even if others thought they were pulling my strings. Each day that passed, I allowed them to sink deeper into their own illusion. Tyler strutted around talking about market trends as though he were the mayor of Wall Street, while Madison filled boxes with my casserole dishes and linen napkins as if she had already claimed them. I didn't stop her, let her wrap plates in newspaper and tape them shut. She was only boxing up her own shame. I knew where the real story ended, and it wasn't with me walking away empty-handed. It was with them discovering that the treasure chest they thought they'd stolen was nothing but driftwood dressed up to look valuable, and all I had to do was wait for the tide to reveal it. The funny thing is that waiting didn't feel like weakness anymore. It felt like strength. Each morning I brewed my coffee, opened the curtains to the Atlantic, and told myself I was playing a longer game. I tended the hydrangeas out front, walked down to the shoreline to collect shells, and kept my routine as normal as possible, because normalcy was its own kind of bait. Tyler and Madison saw me calm, unbothered, going about my days, and they mistook it for defeat, never realizing it was patience. I had turned into the calm eye at the center of their storm, and they never even noticed. At night, as I sat on the porch swing listening to the creak of the chains and the crash of the waves, I would picture the moment coming, the meeting in an office, the signatures exchanged, the sudden realization when the truth broke open. I imagined Tyler's smug face twisting in confusion, Madison's bravado melting into shame, and me sitting steady, letting the tide do its work. That picture kept me strong. That picture reminded me that every storm eventually passes, and when it does, those who built on sand will always be swept away, while those who anchored in stone will still be standing. The morning of the closing arrived like a carefully staged play, where I already knew the ending while the others believed the spotlight belonged to them. And as I dressed in my navy blue dress, the one Daniel had always said made me look like I could command a courtroom, I felt a calm strength settle over me because the day I had been waiting for had finally come. Madison and Tyler strutted with excitement, their voices brimming with confidence that everything was locked in, and I allowed them to march ahead into the title office with their folders of sloppy papers, while I followed silently, steady and prepared, knowing the moment was near when arrogance would meet reality. The office smelled faintly of coffee and fresh ink, the air heavy with the weight of documents and signatures, and when the title manager typed in the parcel number and frowned, I knew the tide had begun to turn in my favor. The buyer's attorney leaned forward as the records appeared on the screen, showing not a charming beach cottage, but a condemned property marked by storm damage and demolition orders, and the silence that followed was more powerful than any accusation I could have spoken. Tyler shifted in his chair, trying to brush it off as clerical error, while Madison's smile twitched like a paper mask slipping in the rain, and I reached into my folder with the calm certainty of a woman who knows the truth will always outshine a lie. I laid down the trust documents, notarized and flawless, proving that my cottage was safely protected under Sea Glass Trust with lifetime rights granted to me alone, and the attorney's sharp eyes softened in recognition as he compared my precise packet to the careless stack in front of him. I didn't need to raise my voice or point fingers. The contrast itself was devastating, and in that quiet room I watched their false power dissolve like salt in water. The buyer snapped his briefcase shut with visible irritation, declaring he wanted nothing to do with such confusion, and the title manager, in measured tones, explained that irregularities in signatures and notary stamps could not be ignored and might, in fact, warrant further investigation. The word elder abuse hung in the air like thunder, and I noticed how quickly Tyler's bluster drained from his face as he stumbled through excuses that sounded weaker with every syllable. Madison could not even look at me, her eyes fixed on the floor, and in that moment the roles reversed entirely. I was no longer the woman they thought they could manipulate. I was the anchor of truth around which the entire room steadied itself. I folded my hands on the table, quiet but firm, and let the professionals do the work of pulling apart the mess my own daughter and her husband had created. For sometimes the sweetest justice is delivered not by shouting, but by silence. When we left the office, the autumn air felt brighter, cleaner, carrying the salty tang of the ocean that had been my constant companion through every storm of life, and I breathed deeply as though tasting freedom itself. Tyler mumbled excuses about clerical mistakes, his confidence shattered, while Madison trailed behind me with her shoulders slumped, unable to hide her shame, and I walked with my head high, knowing that the trap had closed in plain view of witnesses who would not soon forget what they had seen. That evening, I sat on my porch swing, the steady creak of the chains a comfort, and I lifted my cup of tea toward the picture of Daniel smiling from the mantel, whispering that I had kept my promise to protect what was ours. Revenge had not come through rage or fury, but through patience and truth. And as the waves rolled in, steady and strong, I knew the tide had turned for good, leaving me not just with my home intact, but with my dignity restored. The hours after that meeting felt like walking out of a storm shelter and seeing the world washed clean, because for so long I had been shrinking under the weight of betrayal, doubting my own judgment and second-guessing every decision, yet suddenly I was the one holding steady while Madison and Tyler stumbled like sailors who had lost their compass. At home, they were quieter, their confident tones replaced with uneasy half-sentences, and the way Madison looked at me across the kitchen table told me she finally understood that the mother she had dismissed as fragile had outmaneuvered them without raising her voice. Tyler tried to puff himself back up with talk of misunderstandings and legal technicalities, but the arrogance had drained from his eyes, and I could see the cracks in his armor widening with every word he spoke. I realized then that power doesn't always shift with thunderclaps. Sometimes it slips quietly. So quietly the people losing it don't even recognize it until they are already empty-handed. And that was what made it so satisfying. For weeks they had treated me like a pawn in their game, pushing papers in front of me, whispering over spreadsheets, packing boxes with the smug assurance that I was too weak to resist. And now the truth had snapped into place, turning their confidence into shame and leaving me stronger than I had felt in years. I didn't need to gloat, I didn't need to punish them with cruel words, because the sight of their heads bowed lower each day was its own confirmation that balance had been restored, and in my heart I carried the calm certainty that justice had finally taken its rightful seat. Madison sat across from me one evening, her hands wrapped around a mug she barely sipped from, and for the first time since this nightmare began, her eyes filled with tears she couldn't hold back. She whispered about Tyler's debts, about the pressure he had put on her, about the fear of never getting ahead, but her voice lacked the defiance she once wore like armor. And in that moment, I saw not a hardened betrayer, but the frightened girl I used to guide through thunderstorms with a flashlight and a blanket. I listened, not to excuse her, but to understand. And I let the silence stretch between us until she realized that forgiveness was not something I owed. It was something she had to earn, and that earning it would take more than words spoken in shame. I felt no urge to collapse under her apology, only the strength to set boundaries she would have to respect from now on. From that point forward, the dynamic of our family was no longer theirs to command. It was mine to define. And I drew the lines clearly, firmly, and without hesitation. There would be no more secret papers slipped under my nose, no more unchecked access to accounts, no more treating my home as an inheritance already claimed, because I was not their stepping stone. I was the foundation they had foolishly underestimated. The power had shifted not in anger, but in quiet clarity. And as I walked through my cottage, touching the walls Daniel and I had built with our hands, I felt the strength of knowing that I had risen from the role of victim to the role of guardian, and that no storm, no betrayal, and no illusion of control could take that away from me again. In the days that followed the failed closing, I allowed the dust to settle while I quietly pulled out the last card I had been holding all along. The one detail that turned their entire scheme from foolish to humiliating. Because what Madison and Tyler never realized was that the property they had been so eager to market, the so-called beach house they tried to sell, was in fact nothing more than a liability I had quietly purchased years earlier. Long before their ambitions took root, I had acquired the deed to the storm-damaged shack down the lane for pennies, not because I needed it, but because it gave me peace of mind to control the land near my cottage, and with ownership came knowledge of its long list of unpaid fines, code violations, and demolition orders that made it worth less than the nails holding it together. Every time they boasted about closing deals and lining up buyers, I had to hide my smile, because they weren't seizing a prize from me. They were walking themselves into a burden so heavy it could have dragged them under for years. The irony of it made me laugh late at night when I thought of Tyler bragging about reallocation of assets and market trends, unaware that the asset he was banking on came with bills bigger than his bravado. Madison, too, had paraded the glossy flyers and virtual staging as though she had struck gold, never noticing that the basement described in glowing terms was actually full of black mold and soggy insulation. The truth was that the property they tried to sell was not just worthless, but dangerous, the kind of parcel that could swallow money like a sinkhole. And if the sale had somehow gone through, they would have been saddled with lawsuits, angry buyers, and debts they couldn't crawl out of. I didn't need to invent revenge. It had already been built into the very ground they thought they could claim. When I finally told Madison the truth, her face went pale in a way I had never seen before, because she understood in that instant, not only had she failed to steal from me, she had nearly tied herself to a disaster that would have ruined her future. I explained slowly, calmly, that the shack had been under my control from the beginning, that I had purchased the note to protect our lane from falling into the wrong hands, and that I had allowed her to chase this mirage long enough for her to learn what greed really costs. Tyler blustered and accused me of setting them up, but his words rang hollow, because the only trap here was the one their own arrogance had built, and all I had done was stand back and let them trip into it. Madison's silence was heavier than any excuse she could have offered, and for once she had no clever retort, only the stunned realization that her betrayal had backfired so completely there was no way to salvage pride. That night, as I sat alone on the porch with the cool autumn air brushing my face, I felt the strangest mix of emotions, a blend of sadness that it had come to this and relief that justice had unfolded in such perfect symmetry. The waves crashed steadily against the shore as though applauding the irony, and I thought of Daniel and how he always said life has a way of balancing itself out if you let it. My daughter had tried to steal my home and my memories, but instead she had almost shackled herself to a crumbling ruin, and that was the kind of karmic twist no one could plan better than fate itself. In that moment, I understood that revenge doesn't always need fury or fire. Sometimes it is nothing more than stepping aside and letting arrogance carry its own weight until it finally collapses. And in their collapse, I found not only protection for myself, but a lesson that would echo in their lives long after the tide rolled back. After the final twist revealed itself and the truth stood clear, I knew the story couldn't simply end with humiliation alone, because humiliation fades, but boundaries endure. And I realized it was my turn to set rules that would protect me and teach Madison lessons she had tried to outrun her entire adult life. For the first time in years, I spoke to her not just as her mother, but as a woman who had been wronged. A woman who would no longer tolerate being treated as weak, and I told her plainly that from now on, nothing involving my home, my finances, or even my smallest possessions would ever move without my explicit approval. I could see the way her face fell, how she realized the days of slipping into my kitchen to rifle through papers or leaning on my good nature to smooth over Tyler's arrogance were over. And though she wanted to argue, she could not deny the authority in my voice, because authority born of truth carries a weight no excuse can bend. Tyler sputtered for days after, trying to spin stories about clerical errors and misunderstandings, hoping to claw back a shred of dignity, but his words were as empty as the shack he had nearly sold. And even Madison began to look at him differently when she saw how quickly he retreated from responsibility. I let him talk himself into circles while I stayed silent, because silence can be more powerful than shouting. And with every spin of his excuses, he wrapped himself tighter in the rope of his own lies. I didn't need to punish him. His failure had already stripped him of pride, leaving him exposed as nothing more than a man who had thought he could play with documents and signatures as though they were toys, forgetting that real homes and real lives were at stake. Watching him crumble without me lifting a finger reminded me that sometimes strength is not about striking back, but about holding steady until the other side falls apart. Madison, though, was a more complicated story, because beneath her greed I still glimpsed the frightened little girl who used to crawl into my bed during storms, clutching her blanket and whispering that she was afraid the waves would swallow the house whole. When I looked at her now, I saw the same fear, but this time it wasn't the ocean she dreaded. It was the consequences of her own choices. She cried one evening, admitting that she had been swept along by Tyler's debts and promises, believing that selling the cottage would be the answer to their troubles. And I listened without interrupting, not because her excuses absolved her, but because I wanted her to hear the sound of her own voice admitting what she had done. When the words dried up and silence filled the room, I told her gently but firmly that love does not erase betrayal. It only survives it if respect is rebuilt, and rebuilding would take years, not days. She nodded, small and humbled, and for the first time in a long while, she understood that forgiveness was no longer free. From that moment forward, I became not just her mother, but her boundary, the line she could not cross without consequence. And it was liberating to realize that strength had been in me all along, waiting for the moment I stopped mistaking kindness for weakness. I put protections in place, locks on accounts, alerts on documents, and allies on watch, and I made it clear that family connection would never again be a free pass for exploitation. The cottage remained mine, the walls still humming with Daniel's laughter, the porch swing still creaking under the weight of long evenings, and I could finally walk through the rooms without fear of someone waiting to snatch it away. Madison's shame became her teacher, Tyler's silence became his prison, and I stood steady in the center of it all, the storm behind me and the calm of justice stretching out ahead. In the weeks that followed the collapse of their scheme, the air in my home felt different, lighter somehow, because the constant tension of waiting for the next betrayal was gone, replaced instead by the silence of two people forced to face the wreckage of their own choices. Madison moved slower, no longer sweeping into my kitchen with the bold steps of someone certain she had the upper hand, but instead sitting carefully at the table as though unsure if she still had a place there, and I let her sit, because sometimes the weight of unspoken truth does more to change a person than lectures ever could. I noticed how she began to avoid Tyler's gaze, how her sentences carried fewer of his phrases about leverage and opportunity, and how her hands fidgeted nervously when the subject of money surfaced, because now she understood that she had gambled with more than finances. She had gambled with family and nearly lost it all. There were moments when I caught glimpses of the daughter I used to know, the girl who had once followed me along the beach with a bucket full of shells and eyes wide with wonder. And those glimpses tugged at me, reminding me that beneath the greed there was still someone worth saving. One evening, she confessed that Tyler had promised her the cottage would be their ticket to a better life, that he had convinced her I no longer needed it, that it was wasted space for an old woman clinging to the past, and as she spoke, her voice broke, her shoulders slumping under the weight of shame. I listened quietly, stirring my tea and letting her words hang heavy in the room, because forgiveness cannot bloom until the soil of truth is broken open. And in her tears, I saw the cracks where understanding might finally take root. It wasn't relief I felt, not yet, but a cautious hope that perhaps my daughter was beginning to see the cost of letting ambition replace loyalty. Tyler, on the other hand, grew more silent with every passing day, retreating into himself as Madison stopped echoing his ideas, and the arrogance that once filled every corner of his presence seemed to collapse inward until all that was left was the shadow of a man whose plans had unraveled. I didn't confront him, because life itself had already delivered a harsher punishment than I ever could, stripping him of pride and leaving him exposed as a schemer who had failed not just in business, but in character. Madison's awakening was sharpened by his downfall, because she could see clearly now the emptiness of the promises she had believed, and the difference between my steady patience and his hollow ambition stood in stark contrast before her. She never said it outright, but the way she lingered in my kitchen, the way she offered to help with small chores, and the way she began to smile faintly when I spoke, told me she was reaching for a rope to pull herself out of the hole she had dug. For me, the aftermath was not about vengeance anymore. It was about balance, because I had already won the battle that mattered, and now what remained was deciding whether the pieces of my relationship with Madison could be salvaged. I didn't rush it. I didn't let nostalgia soften me too quickly, but I allowed the door to stay open just enough for her to prove herself, because while betrayal can scar, love has a way of stitching even the deepest wounds if enough honesty is poured into the seam. Each evening when I sat on my porch and listened to the ocean, I felt Daniel's presence beside me, and I thought about how he would have wanted me to protect myself without hardening my heart completely. And so I chose patience once again, knowing that time would reveal if my daughter's awakening was real or just another fleeting wave. In the weeks that turned into months, I realized that words alone would never be enough to mend what had been broken, because apologies can be sweet on the tongue, but meaningless if they are not followed by action. And so I waited to see whether Madison's awakening would grow into real change or simply fade, like footprints washed away by the tide. She began small, coming by on Saturdays with groceries she insisted on paying for, offering to rake the leaves in the yard or help patch the peeling paint on the porch railings. And at first, I let her do these things quietly without praise, because I needed to know if she was doing them out of guilt or out of genuine effort to rebuild trust. Watching her work with her hands, shoulders hunched and brow furrowed, reminded me of the girl who once helped Daniel and me hammer planks into the cottage deck, and slowly I began to believe there might be hope for her to rediscover the value of honesty and effort. Tyler's presence dwindled during this time, his swagger stripped away, his visits growing fewer until eventually he stopped coming altogether, and though Madison never said it outright, I could tell by the relief in her eyes that his grip on her had loosened. She seemed lighter without him, as though a heavy stone had been lifted from her chest, and it was in those moments that I saw a clearer version of my daughter, no longer parroting someone else's ambition, but beginning to stand on her own feet. Still, I knew better than to let relief blind me, and so I tested her resolve in subtle ways, asking her to handle errands that required patience, or to follow through on promises that demanded consistency, because rebuilding trust is not a single gesture, but a series of small, steady steps, and I needed proof that she was willing to walk that long road. One of the most telling moments came when Ruth, my neighbor and quiet ally, asked Madison to volunteer at the women's shelter she supported, and instead of rolling her eyes or offering excuses, Madison showed up in worn jeans and an old sweatshirt, ready to scrub walls and paint trim. I stopped by one afternoon to see her there, a paintbrush in her hand and flecks of blue scattered across her cheeks, and I felt something shift inside me as I watched her laugh with women she barely knew while rolling fresh color onto tired walls. It was in that laughter, humble and unguarded, that I saw the beginning of real change, because service has a way of stripping away ego, and the daughter who once tried to steal from me was now giving her time freely to those who had even less than she did. That proof mattered more than any apology, because actions like that cannot be faked for long. For myself, this season of testing was also a season of quiet strength, because it reminded me that survival is not just about weathering storms, but about demanding better from the people you love, and I learned that boundaries can coexist with compassion if you hold them steady. Each time Madison showed up and followed through, the walls of anger inside me softened a little, not enough to erase the scars, but enough to allow new growth where the damage had been. I still carried Daniel's memory with me like a lantern guiding my way, and I often whispered to him on the porch that our daughter might finally be finding her way back, not because I dragged her, but because she chose to walk herself. And in those whispers, I found peace, because true redemption is never handed over easily. It must be earned day by day, proof by proof, until trust feels possible again. As the season shifted and the salty air of Cape Cod turned crisp with autumn, I felt a new rhythm settle over my life, one that was no longer shaped by fear of betrayal, but by the quiet confidence of knowing I had reclaimed both my dignity and my home. The cottage, once shadowed by the threat of being stolen, now felt brighter, safer, and even more precious, because it had survived not just storms of nature, but storms of family greed. I walked from room to room, touching the walls Daniel and I had built with our hands, hearing echoes of laughter instead of whispers of deceit, and every corner of that house reminded me that strength is not in possessions, but in the courage to protect them. It was not just my home that had been restored, it was my peace of mind, and with it came the simple joy of living without the constant weight of suspicion pressing down on me. Madison's slow transformation became part of this new rhythm, because though the scars of her betrayal would never fully fade, I could see in her eyes that the lesson had rooted deeply. She came each week not to take, but to give, bringing flowers for the porch, fixing what needed fixing, and sometimes simply sitting with me in silence as we watched the waves roll in. And I realized that these quiet moments were more valuable than any grand apology. For the first time in years, our conversations drifted back to ordinary things: recipes, neighbors, the stubborn hydrangeas that refused to bloom, and those small exchanges felt like threads weaving us together again. I knew better than to trust blindly, but I also knew that growth is fragile, and I chose to water it with patience rather than crush it with bitterness. The absence of Tyler was its own kind of victory, because without his shadow hanging over her, Madison seemed freer, more like herself, less tangled in schemes and debts. I never asked her where he had gone or what had become of him, because some chapters close quietly without needing explanation, and his disappearance from our story felt like the tide sweeping away debris from the shore. In his place came the presence of neighbors, friends, and even strangers who had watched the drama unfold and offered words of support. And their recognition reminded me that when truth is revealed publicly, it strengthens not only the one who speaks it, but also the community that witnesses it. The dignity I thought I had lost forever returned tenfold, because people saw me not as a victim, but as a woman who had endured betrayal and still stood tall. The greatest victory, though, was the freedom inside my own heart, the shift from feeling cornered and betrayed to feeling steady and unshakable, because once you reclaim yourself, no one can take that away again. I understood that revenge was never about destruction, but about restoring balance, and by holding firm, I had not only protected my husband's memory and our home, but also created the chance for my daughter to begin again on different terms. Each evening as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and listened to the gulls cry overhead, I felt the weight lift a little more, until all that remained was the quiet joy of knowing I had survived. I had outlasted the storm, and I had reclaimed a life that was truly mine. When the final echoes of this storm faded, I realized that the greatest gift I had received was not just keeping the cottage safe, but rediscovering the strength that had been in me all along, because what began as a betrayal that nearly broke my heart ended as a lesson that rebuilt my spirit. I no longer looked at my home with fear of losing it, but with gratitude that it had endured, standing tall like a lighthouse that had weathered one more gale. The walls hummed with memories of Daniel, steady and warm, and instead of sadness, I felt comfort, knowing that our love and labor had survived greed, deception, and arrogance. The cottage was more than a house again. It was proof that truth, patience, and quiet resolve are stronger than any storm. Madison continued to walk the slow road of rebuilding, and though trust could never be restored overnight, each small act of service, each quiet moment spent by my side, stitched another thread into the fabric that had been torn. I no longer saw her as the girl who tried to take everything from me, but as a woman who had stumbled and was finally learning how to stand again. And though forgiveness remained cautious, it also felt possible. The absence of Tyler, like the absence of thunder after a storm passes, gave her space to rediscover who she truly was without his shadow pressing down, and I chose to let that silence be her teacher. Watching her change was a reminder that sometimes justice is not only about punishment, but about the chance to grow from mistakes, and that lesson, though hard-won, felt worth carrying forward. Neighbors who had witnessed the unraveling often stopped me in the market or on the sidewalk to say they admired how I had handled it, and their words filled me with a quiet pride I never sought but deeply appreciated, because dignity restored in the eyes of others is a powerful balm. They told me I had shown that kindness is not weakness, that patience is not surrender, and that even when the people closest to you betray your trust, you can still rise without losing your soul. Hearing those words reminded me that our stories do not belong only to us. They ripple outward, shaping the way others see resilience, and in sharing mine, I had unknowingly become a mirror for others who carried their own secret storms. In the end, the moral was simple, as clear as the horizon after the clouds break. Never mistake kindness for permission, never assume that patience means defeat, and never forget that life, like the tide, always returns what is deserved. Greed may roar like a wave, betrayal may sting like salt in an open wound, but truth and love are steady currents that carry us safely back to shore. As I sat on my porch one quiet evening, a warm cup of tea in my hands, and the sound of gulls overhead, I whispered to Daniel that the storm had passed, the sea was calm again, and balance had been restored. And in that peace, I felt the deepest victory of all, the certainty that no matter how fierce the storm, goodness, patience, and quiet strength will always prevail. And if you're still here with me, I'd love for you to be part of this little community we're building together, because your likes, your comments, and even just pressing that subscribe button mean more than you know. When you share your own thoughts or tell me where you're listening from, it feels like we're sitting on the same porch, sipping tea, and talking about life's storms and the calm that comes after. So if this story touched you, if it reminded you of something in your own life, drop a comment, hit that like, and subscribe. It helps me keep telling these stories, and it makes me feel like I'm not alone out here by the sea.